This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring a discussion on significant aspects of virtual G20 summit. The participants are Sheelkant Sharma, former diplomat, and Lalima Aneja, anchor.
Yesterday, the Honorable Prime Minister addressed the G20 meet virtually. India heading the G20 summit has been a stupendous success under the aegis of the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi, as he focused on an inclusive growth with the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, a philosophy which was given to the world by Bharat. He also became the voice of the Global South. On this and much more, we have with us former Ambassador Mr. Sheelkant Sharma. Welcome, sir, to the Akashvani studios.
Thank you. Namaskar.
So it's very interesting to note that right at the beginning of the summit, we saw that African Union was included in the summit, and we saw the warm hug between the two leaders, which means that the deliberations which had taken place all over the 200 cities, they were very successful and meaningful because this was a very prompt decision. How does this reflect on our presidency?
Well, this is, as Prime Minister stated in his virtual summit address, this is actually reinforcement and fortification of the voice of the Global South in G20, because the joining of African Union as a member of G20 is a big step. And it's a matter of pride for India that under its presidency, Africa was given a voice. In the last 1 year in the G20, the Global South's voice has been heard. Now, this is the most significant because when the summit was taking place in Delhi, the Prime Minister made sure that African Union is present. So this adds to the whole footprint of the G20. It covers the Global South in a very ample measure. And African Union representative in the G20 brings to the meetings and its deliberations the voice of Africa, which is very important for us.
Right.
So that's the significance of the African Union joining the G20. As Prime Minister's opening statement, he said that I can never forget the moment when in Delhi all of us welcomed the African Union into the G20. This message of inclusivity given by the G20 to the world is unprecedented.
Right. So thanks to the G20 summit, we are now talking about restructuring of multilateral development banks. They are probably in the process of reorganizing themselves. We saw the example of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which was taken over by China on lease because they couldn't pay the credit. So we are now talking about the multilateral development banks must increase their credit for the rich countries and must help the poor countries. This is one small example. Of course, much more needs to be done in the new world order. Do you think that the restructuring of MDBs, as we call them, has it started?
Yes, actually, as our finance minister mentioned, that the International Monetary Fund, the Financial Stability Board, and the FATF, they have to update the G20 nations and others. And she said that after the virtual G20 Leaders Summit, she said there is no timeline yet for countries to implement the roadmap. But the early phase of the next presidency, which is with Brazil, will provide more clarity. And she said it was the multilateral development banks have to reform the economic and the global governance structure. Both need to have reforms. And the G20 underlines this, the summit and the virtual summit also underlines these two actions.
It's all the more important because G20 was formed considering the financial difficulties of the nations, right?
Yes, because, the debt relief was a major item on the agenda. And the transparency about the whole infrastructure development, it should not be such as would put the recipient country into a debt trap.
Right.
So debt relief for developing countries and improving their prospects for development is one of the main planks of G20's thrust in the India's presidency. And the baton is now taken up by Brazil, and it is expected that they will carry it forward.
Yes, and that also should be a bit of a challenge for the MDBs because this is one fora where the developing and the developed nations are on the same page. But let's move on. When we wound up the G20 summit, the Ukraine-Russia war, of course, was on, but much later the Hamas and Israel conflict started. And the Prime Minister yesterday expressed his relief over the release of hostages on both sides, which also dispels the fear of the conflict becoming bigger, which was a very real fear because many of the countries are now seen siding with either one or the other. That's a big relief. Of course, terrorism has always been on the agenda, and the Prime Minister often talks of zero tolerance to terrorism. How are we now taking this forward?
Again, when you see PM's statement, there he emphasizes that G20 strongly condemns terrorism and violence and that there is zero tolerance to terrorism. He said killing of innocents, particularly women and children, is unacceptable. And he then mentions these 6-7 points which are important for the resolution of the crisis which is created by Hamas attack on Israel and subsequent war. He says that humanitarian assistance must be provided readily, effectively and safely. Then G20 welcomes agreement on humanitarian pause and release of hostages. Then he underlined that a two-state solution is the permanent solution for Israeli-Palestine issue.
Yeah.
And then he said, dialogue and diplomacy are the only means to resolve geopolitical conflicts. So this is the line which has a certain internal consistency. Zero tolerance to terrorism, total unacceptability of violence against civilians and particularly women and children. Humanitarian dimension must be addressed. So in that context, the agreement done yesterday about humanitarian pause for 4 days, and the chances of it increasing because the report is that for every 10 hostages released, other side has agreed to extend the pause by one more day. So if this pause continues for a longer period, it will allow the people in Gaza to come back to even a modicum of normalcy. And this will be done with common agreement. So there is hope for peace in that area. And then PM actually said that we welcome the news of release of hostages yesterday and hope for the swift release of all hostages.
Right.
Because it's just not the question of 50, but there are more than that. And the captives should be released because the agreement in Qatar between Israel and Hamas talks of release of captives. And the important dimension, which, as you mentioned, that the conflict should not spread. The present conflict between Israel and Hamas should not become a regional conflict because it will have very deleterious consequences for all the countries in the region.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, and I hope that this agreement yesterday and the diplomacy which preceded that, it didn't come in a single day or something. There was hard work where US, Egypt, Qatar and Israel and Hamas were involved. And there were a lot of to and fro. Newspapers have now given extensive reporting on how this whole process was done over the last several weeks. So what has been the closure, what has happened now yesterday, is the result of hard work, and they should now sustain it and build upon it. That seems to be the way forward. Prime Minister has underlined this aspect. The clouds of crisis that we are witnessing today, as one family, we possess the strength to work towards peace. From the point of view of human welfare, we can strengthen our voice against terror and violence and for humanity. So he says today India is prepared to walk together, shoulder to shoulder, to meet the expectations of the world and of humanity. G20 has to speak for humanity, and the emphasis should be on peace and one family, one future, as was the motto at the time of the G20 summit. So this augurs well actually at the virtual summit. The agreement between Hamas and Israel was a good augury.
And India did walk the talk by sending huge tons of relief material for the Palestine. Well, let's move on. Back home, the Honorable Prime Minister, sir, spoke of aspirational district program, which involves about 25 crore people. G20 countries are big, very big. It's a big fora. What is the link between aspirational district program and how can G20 countries help in that?
I think it was actually broad basing the thrust of the G20 framework. So when we had the summit, we had organized a meeting connected with the summit into so many places in India.
Yes.
They were north, south. The whole country was actually brought together in its link with the G20. And in this kind of broad basing, we linked this whole program. And if you see the proceedings of the G20 and the Prime Minister's address, this emphasis on getting the districts, it is there that the whole development process is anchored. And if we can get the districts, coordinated, their development and their progress coordinated, we are starting at a different grassroots, you see. So this is very crucial. And you see, G20 had various forums, women and technology 20, youth, and all these forums actually, they converge to create overall development and progress. And particularly this applies to the Global South, whose voice India managed to get when we organized the Global South Summit before the G20 Summit.
So it was a homework well done.
Yes, it was well prepared, well prepared.
When we talk of digitization, well, that has been a great success story in our country. And we have probably world's largest number of digital transactions, sir. We have established a DPIR, which means a Digital Public Infrastructure Repository. Over 50 DPIs from 60 countries have been incorporated. The Prime Minister proposed a social impact fund where he said India can commit $25 million to the fund. Are we now poised to create a digital revolution, not just within India, but across the world?
Indian success about digitalization is unprecedented. If you see the way we have done financial digitalization, now there's just on the mobile phone, you have all money. Your mobile phone carries money. Even at a small hawker who sells vegetables can have the QR code and you can transact business. It is such an ease of business and it is so fair. Everything is in the clear. It is all digitally recorded. So there is no scope for any unlawful transactions. And the sheer number of these transactions in India is largest in the world.
Yes.
The total number of transactions and the amount of money involved in this digital processes. So everyone is looking up to India. And Prime Minister, as you know, his commitment always is for Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam and one family, one future. So he has fully supported this initiative for moving digitalization in a global context. And this fund of $25 million is a good step forward. It's a seed money to start this whole process.
Right.
And again, this is our mantra that able to do good, we want to do it for the larger community, for the Global South. So this is what in the digital partnership, there's also this talk about AI, for instance. There again, PM has emphasized not on G20, but separately about global partnership. So we are moving in all directions.
Yes.
And we want to coordinate and coalesce and converge efforts by all countries so that, it comes to the benefit of all. And this digitalization, for instance, is really a great move forward.
And apart from all that we talked about, you also mentioned artificial intelligence. The Prime Minister showed his leadership qualities by initiating a global biofuel alliance at G20. Just as he started the ISA, which is the International Solar Alliance of countries which have the solar power. He also talked about lifestyle for environment, pro-planet approach, renewable energy and much more. Not just that, he also spoke of gender equality and mentioned the fact that we now have 33% reservation for women in parliament and state legislative assemblies. We could talk more on this, but time is short. Ambassador, thank you so much for talking to us and sparing your precious time for your views and reviews. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on significant aspects of virtual G20 summit. The participants were Sheelkant Sharma, former diplomat, and Lalima Aneja, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.